And now I'd like to introduce you to the person that our Tony Blankley fellow, Tom Rogan, calls the nicest and kindest person at Fox News, Shannon Bream.
Doesn't know how you lose. She loves when everybody's watching. She loves the way her body moves. She loves the way they all crawl back when she said,
thank you so much. Thank you all so much. There's such good energy in this room. I could tell from meeting a few of you in the hallway as I was coming in. You guys are fired up, right? You've had your Wheaties this morning, I could definitely tell. I am so excited to be here with you. It's fair to say that they're in Washington right now. I can't remember a time when it's been so volatile, so exciting, a little bit crazy. So I'm really happy to be here with you today to talk about a lot of what's going on there. From the Supreme Court confirmation fight to the midterms, there's a lot to cover. I've been covering Washington as a reporter and a news anchor for 14 years now, and it's fair to say nothing would surprise me anymore. I mean, we mentioned the scandals, the sex scandals, the indictments, fist fights, I've seen those, so nothing would surprise me anymore in Washington. But this isn't my first tour of duty. I was there as a college intern about 25 years ago. I worked for a member of Congress who was a great guy. He was a gentleman, you'd probably know his name, but because of the rest of the story, I can't tell you who it was. He was a great guy, and he learned all the interns' names. He took us to lunch at the members' dining room. He actually gave us substantive things to do. And then there was his chief of staff. He was definitely the bad cop in the good cop, bad cop scenario in this office. And I noticed on day one, when the member left the office, the smiles fell off of everyone's faces. And the chief of staff comes out and he looks at this new intern and he yells at me, "Get me General so-and-so on the phone." And this is before the internet. So I thought, how does one track down a general? And I looked over and I picked up the huge white pages and I thought, I'm pretty sure they don't have direct lines to the top Pentagon brass in the white pages, but I need to take some action. I don't really know what to do. I looked around to the other staffers and interns in the office and he yelled again, "Anyone who helps her is fired." So, welcome to Washington. That night, I also survived an attempted mugging on the metro, the subway system in DC. So despite that crazy, scary start to Washington, I actually fell in love with DC. After that, though, I went off to law school, and I practiced for a few years. I never knew I'd have the privilege of coming back to see and to cover what I think is one of the most exciting, interesting, certainly most impactful cities in the world, Washington, D.C. There is never a dull moment there, but I don't think that even 2 or 3 years ago, any of us could have predicted the landscape of what's going on in Washington right now. Spring of 2015, I interviewed then businessman Donald Trump. He was flirting with running for president again, which he'd done many times before. I thought he's probably crying wolf. He loves the attention. This is a lot of fun for all of us. I was at Trump Towers and I interviewed him. And as soon as we were done, he said, "I want to talk to you away from the cameras. Let's take off our microphones." And he was very concerned. And he said to me, "I don't think you're taking me seriously." And I said, "Mr. Trump, I'll be honest with you, I'm not, because I'm not sure you're going to run." I'd ask him all these very deep DC policy probing questions, and his answers were always the same. He said, "I'm the only one who knows how to create jobs, and I'm the only one who knows how to make America great again." So while he was short on details, he was definitely not short on passion, and so I left that interview thinking, maybe he's serious this time. Well, fast forward a few weeks later, it was June 16th, 2015, I was going in for a surgery. And if you've done surgeries before, you know it's waiting, you're in your freezing cold gown that's made out of like paper and it's 60 degrees in there, you got your IV in, and they had the local talk and radio and traffic station piping into the waiting area. And they kept saying, "Donald Trump, we're waiting, we're going to the press conference today. He's gonna make some kind of announcement at Trump Tower." Waiting. Finally, they take me in for my surgery and I miss everything. So I go in, I go under, I come out, and if you've had anesthesia before, you know you have a lot of thoughts in your mind as you're coming back to your normal self. And normally you would have a filter to stop yourself from saying things. Anyone with anesthesia, you know what I'm talking about? And so I'm thinking about this, and in my mind, I say to one of the nurses, I grab her arm, and I was like, oh my gosh, I had the craziest dream that Donald Trump is running for president. And she took my hand off of her and said, it's real life. He is. So that's how I found out Donald Trump was actually going to run for president. He proved me wrong from not taking him seriously a few weeks before that. So he's the very definition of a disruptor. At times, he drives people on both sides of the aisle nuts, but he doesn't care. He's doing things his own way. And when I talk to what I like to call the real Americans outside the Beltway, when I go out and see my family, your families, people who voted for him, and they say to me, he's doing exactly what he told us he was going to do, and this is why we voted for him. So we're not mad. We love it. We love that he makes Washington mad, and lawmakers on both sides of the aisle crazy. For us, he's delivering on what he promised. So that's what I hear from folks outside the Beltway. So let's talk about that. He's stacking the federal courts with very young conservative judges who are going to be there for decades. He's rolling back regulations that we've heard from businesses from the IRS to the EPA have made it tougher for them to survive and be profitable in America. He's walked away from a number of big international agreements and things that he felt like were not in the best interest of the United States of America. And pro-lifers tell me that he is actually the best friend that they've ever had in the White House. Right now, he's working on using the regulatory system to strip tens of millions of dollars from Planned Parenthood if this HHS regulation on Title VII goes through, unless they agree to stop performing abortions. And I have a lot of pro-life people tell me Congress wasn't getting it done, he's doing it. And so understandably, the left is very concerned and very unhappy that he's undoing a lot of the Obama-era regulations and pronouncements. You know, it was gridlock then on the Hill, which is a big problem in D.C., and so there was a lot of executive action that was used. Now, this president's having to do it too. So we're always watching to see, and we'll talk about Congress and their ratings, how they're doing, as there is not a whole lot getting done in Washington. So we know now that the left has used the courts quite a bit, very predictably successfully against the president. If you file in the Ninth Circuit, that's always a good bet if you're trying to stop the president. So they've used the courts, and now they're hoping to use the midterms to stop him as well. So let's talk about history here. It tells us that the first midterm elections for a new president, the president's party is expected to lose, often loses roughly 30 House seats. Now, we all know here that that would mean Democrats would retake control of the House. And 4 Senate seats, that historically happens, which almost no one is predicting that would happen this time around. So how is the president doing in the primaries? So far, very well, including this week in Ohio District 12, which was actually a special election. There's a very tight lead there for the Republican. We're told by the Secretary of State that there's still a lot of thousands of provisional and absentee ballots to be counted there. But for now, he is claiming victory. But Democrats are as well, because they say this should scare the GOP, that it never should have been that close, even if the Republican is the one who ends up winning. And they say it is an omen that is good for them going into the midterms, because that was a district the president won by 11 points in 2016. So this is very different. The president wasn't on this ballot. We know the left is very angry and very energized against the president, but they're also split on some key issues that could make a difference going into the midterms. One of the big ones is impeachment, the I word. We have all seen Congresswoman Maxine Waters. She regularly chants, "Impeach 45." But we're not just talking about chanting. Twice they have voted on this in the House, and in January, 66 House Democrats actually voted to impeach the President of the United States, or to move forward with their impeachment proceedings. So there's a split within the Democratic Party about whether they should be talking about this. You're all probably familiar with the name of the progressive billionaire Tom Steyer in California. He wants to impeach the president. He runs commercials. I see them all the time. He's spending $110 million this fall on midterm elections. And he says that it's a good topic for Democrats. Politico reported on this. They say that Steyer's internal polling that he's run shows 59% of Democrats said yes to this question. Of course, Democrats should talk about impeaching Trump in the Democrats if they win big in November. Now, the same poll reportedly showed that just 21% of Republicans are actually worried that it will happen if Democrats retake the House. So Steyer sees this as a net positive. He says it's not going to get Republicans out to the polls. It will help Democrats, so he wants them to talk about it. Democratic leadership definitely split on this. Here's how the LA Times put it, quote, "If the election is about Donald Trump, that's dandy." This is Peter Hart, a veteran party strategist. "You don't want this election to be about impeaching Donald Trump." That's a notion seconded by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leaders in the House and Senate respectively. Quote, I think it's a gift to Republicans, Pelosi said about this talk of impeachment. So should Republicans be embracing the conversation and using it to warn folks, you got to get out to vote or this is going to happen? Well, here's what the director of the Marist Institute for Public Opinion Polling says, quote, the threat of impeachment provides Republicans their best point of attack looking toward the midterm elections. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about it from their arsenal as they try to isolate the Robert Mueller investigation, which we'll talk about, and delegitimize it. If there's a silver lining for Republicans in the recent polling data, it's the impeachment question. Now, Marist polling also showed a majority of Republicans and independents, which they need going into the fall, said they would vote against a candidate who promised they were going to impeach the president. Now, there's also this inside the Beltway conspiracy theory that the president, although he would not be happy about being on the losing end of the midterm elections, wouldn't mind running against the Democrats for a couple of years as he heads into the 2020 re-election campaign. We all know he likes to fight. He likes an opponent. And he may get one because Congressman Al Green, who has this Democrat from Texas, he has introduced the impeachment proceedings more than once. He said not long ago, we're not finished. So if Democrats retake the House, somehow I don't think, although the president's going to be stinging from the loss, if they try to impeach him, I don't think he's going to back down from that. I much more think what you're going to hear from Donald J. Trump is, bring it on. I think he will welcome the challenge. I do. Not that we're clapping for impeachment, but we're clapping that he would not be afraid of it. Now, there's the other I word in Washington, which is immigration. What is getting done on this? Gallup keeps this running tally of polls about what Americans care about. The question is, what do you think is the most important problem facing the country today? Now, the top answer in July was, quote, immigration and illegal aliens. Lawmakers know it, and they're not getting anything done on it. The polls also show us a majority of Americans do agree that there should be some kind of resolution for the dreamers, people who were brought here illegally as children, but most of them are well into adulthood at this point. There's no consensus, though, about what to do with them, what kind of legal status to give them, how to get there. I have Republicans come on my show all the time and point fingers at each other and say, you're for amnesty. No, you're for amnesty. They can't get anything passed on the Hill, much less getting something done with the Democrats. But the president has said, as he did all through his campaign, that he wants the wall. And that's going to help. And that was a big selling point, and it was a reason that a lot of folks voted for him. He hasn't been able to get the funding yet. So now he's talking about the potential for a government shutdown. And that makes a lot of folks on the Hill very nervous because we know, polls show us historically, when there's a government shutdown, Republicans get blamed. But the more important question is, even if they get blamed, the polls show us that's historically true, will the voters actually take it out on them the next time that there is an election? So I want to give you a historical look at this. This is a piece by Jake Novak. He says, what about those two government shutdowns in late 1995 and early 96 that the Republican Congress took the blame for? Didn't it lead to major political punishment for the GOP, then House Speaker Newt Gingrich, and 1996 Republican presidential nominee Bob Dole? That's not exactly what happened, he writes. In the 1996 congressional elections, the GOP actually won a net gain of 2 seats in the Senate and only lost 2 seats in the House. Picking up a greater Senate majority is much more valuable to any political party, especially if the only trade-off is losing 2 seats out of 435 total in the House. And yes, we all know that Dole lost to Clinton in the presidential election, but blaming Dole's loss on the government shutdown is a colossal stretch. So he goes on to say, what about the markets? Didn't they take a big hit when the government shut down? Nope. The last 3 government shutdowns have resulted in gains. Yes, gains for the broader markets. That includes a healthy 3.1% gain for the S&P 500 during the 2013 shutdown. You guys probably remember this. Senator Ted Cruz trying to block the implementation of Obamacare and reading Green Eggs and Ham to his girls on the floor at night on the Senate as he was trying to keep things going. This is what an editorial on investors.com says about that shutdown. Once again, Republicans got blamed, and President Obama tried to make sure that the shutdown inflicted as much political pain for Republicans as him by maximizing the inconveniences imposed on the public as much as possible, including down sections of the National Mall. I think we all remember the World War II veterans showing up at their memorial and people sort of saying, I don't see you. walking past the barricades there. Those guys were not going to be stopped by a couple of government shutdown barricades, so we remember the optics for that one. At the time, Politico called it a nightmare for the GOP, pointing to a poll that found only 32%, a new low, viewed the GOP favorably, and Americans blamed them for the shutdown over Obama, 53 to 29%. So those aren't good numbers, but here's what happened a year later. Republicans won a sweeping midterm election victory. The party won the Senate majority for the first time in 8 years with a net gain of 9 seats. In the House, the GOP gained 13 seats, giving it the biggest GOP majority since 1928. So the president is no dummy. He reads, he understands history, he knows what happened in these shutdowns. He's taking some heat from his party, and a number of leaders are saying, this time around, it's not going to be positive to do this before the midterms. So he says he's listening to them, he is taking their advice, but we also know he's very unconventional. He's very connected to the American people. He goes right around the mainstream media to Twitter and other platforms, and if he feels like he's more connected with the American people on this issue, I wouldn't play chicken with him. So we'll see what happens with the shutdown. Now, what party leaders would rather be focusing on going into the midterms is the confirmation of Supreme Court nominee Judge Brett Kavanaugh. By all accounts, he's got a stellar resume, more than a decade on the federal bench. He's got the support of liberal and conservative law professors, people across the political spectrum, but he's also got the Democrats trying to stop him. Plenty of opposition. Many pledged to block any nominee long before we knew who it was going to be. They're tussling over documents. They're saying they're going to do whatever it takes to halt his nomination from moving forward. The truth is, if you're just looking at a numbers game, the Republicans have the tiniest of majorities, as you know, in the Senate. And so if they stick together, that's a big if, Brett Kavanaugh will soon be Justice Kavanaugh. Now, interestingly enough, he's met with dozens of senators, including one Democrat so far, Joe Manchin. Next week, he's scheduled to meet with another Democrat, Joe Donnelly, but he hasn't met with two key moderate GOP senators, Collins and Murkowski. Now, both of them are taking a lot of heat during this August recess. From the left and right, they say neither one of them is an automatic yes or no, but they're going to be key to what happens with Kavanaugh. Reminds me of a story. When I was first covering Capitol Hill and working at Fox, I didn't have a lot of big contacts on Capitol Hill. I didn't know a lot of senators, and I needed one for my story. There was one specific one I was working on to get her for the story. And they said, no, we don't have time today, and my deadline is coming. And finally, the office calls and says, okay, if you can get a cameraman and come right now, we can do this. So I show up on the Hill. Keep in mind, at the time, there were two very different senators with very similar names, Mikulski and Murkowski. Very different. So I run in there with my cameraman, we do the whole interview, and I come out and he says, you do realize the entire interview you were calling the senator by the wrong name, right? Yikes. Well, to her credit, she didn't mention it then, and she's never said anything about it since. So she's not only a senator, she is a diplomat as well. But these two names, Collins and Murkowski, they're going to be key to what happens with Kavanaugh. So let's talk about what the president has gotten done with respect to the federal bench. And I'll tell you, the White House has said to me, folks within the White House, that they're actually happy that the mainstream media spends so much time dissecting and debating the president's latest tweets, because in the meantime, they're getting all of these other things done. And they like that there is more attention on what he's doing on Twitter than there is on the federal bench. So far, 26 district court judges have been confirmed, 24 circuit court or appellate level judges, one Supreme Court justice, you may know, Neil Gorsuch, also made it to the bench. The Washington Post puts it this way: the Trump administration has successfully pushed through the Senate the largest number of federal judges than any recent president in his first 2 years. Well, the top Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Dianne Feinstein, says this, quote, the speed at which these judges are being rammed through the process is stunning. I don't think she means that in a positive way, but she's aware of what's happening. So we've already seen the impact of what's happened because of Justice Neil Gorsuch. There have been tight 5-4 decisions where he's been a key factor. One of the cases that you're going to be familiar with, Janus. This is the forced union dues for public sector employees. Whether they wanted to have anything to do with it or not, they still had to pay fees. So Mark Janus is a social worker out of Illinois who decided to stand up. He is a very unassuming guy. If you've seen him on TV, we've had him on our show, or if you've seen interviews with him. But he decided, I don't want a single penny of my paycheck. I don't even touch it. I don't want it going straight into a union whose political ideology I may or may not agree with. So he decided to take this fight. I asked him at the steps of the Supreme Court, did you ever think you would end up here doing something that it would impact potentially millions of people? And he was kind of overwhelmed, but he was so sure of himself because he said, I had faith in the justices that they would see this as a First Amendment speech issue, that my money shouldn't be used for things that I don't agree with, speech I don't agree with. That was a big 5-4 decision. And now it wasn't just striking down what was happening. They've completely changed the framework. In this opinion by Justice Alito, not only do people have to opt out, they've flipped it. Now, if a union wants you and you want to be part of the union, you have to opt in with your fees as a public sector employee. It's a huge difference. And that struck down something that had been going for 41 years. Now, a couple of years ago, they were working on a very similar case at the time that Justice Scalia passed away suddenly. I can't confirm it for all eternity, but we believe he was writing the opinion that most likely would have done something very similar then. Of course, the case ended in a tie after his death, but it came back this year with Justice Alito and that 5-4 decision with Justice Gorsuch as part of the 5 making the difference. That has changed. Of course, you remember the travel ban case as well, the president setting the conditions on which countries would have to cooperate with the U.S. and providing specific information if people wanted to come here. Just about every federal court had ruled against the president, again, file in the Ninth Circuit, if you want to be President Trump. But this was another 5-4 decision. And I honestly, when I heard the arguments, I didn't think it was going to be that close, but it was. And again, Justice Gorsuch's vote made all the difference. The Chief Justice wrote that one, and he said the ban squarely fell within the president's authority. The president immediately tweeted about that one, too. He watches the Supreme Court very closely. So other things that are coming on the horizon to the court that are important: gun control, abortion, immigration, more on executive authority. And even though we had the Masterpiece Cake case, if you remember the 7-2 ruling this year, and this was involving a Christian cake baker who said he would serve anyone, but he wouldn't do a custom cake for a same-sex ceremony. 7-2, the court ruled in his favor, but it was very narrow. And they didn't really get to the substance of this. It will be back very soon. I've interviewed and followed the cases of wedding photographers, calligraphers, florists, bakers. I think it's safe to say that case is coming back. So every one of these justices matters. Now here's something interesting. Fewer than half of Americans can name even one Supreme Court justice, but the numbers also show 90% of them understand that the Supreme Court, these 9 people, impact their daily lives every day. Anyone want to guess who the number 1 recognized justice was? RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was number 1. Who's number 2? I thought it would be Thomas too, but it was the Chief Justice. And Thomas third, of course, because of his place in history. People obviously know his name. Now here's something interesting. I was over at the court a few years ago. With summertime, it was very busy, so there were a lot of tour groups coming through, and I was walking alongside, getting to the court behind a group that had a lot of school kids, and the tour guide said, this is the Supreme Court. I'm going to tell you everything about how it works and who the justices are, and we're going to do a real deep dive on this. And as she's walking, I see Chief Justice John Roberts and one other man walking on the same sidewalk, coming back from lunch or something like that, and he walks right by her and looks at her, and she doesn't even say, oh, that's the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So even people who know about the court may not recognize these men and women who are there, but we all know how critically important they are. The battles are so contentious now with the Supreme Court, it's hard to remember that there was a time when it wasn't partisan. Justice Ginsburg, for example, was actually confirmed 96-3. I can't imagine a vote like that today. Justices Kennedy and Scalia, they were unanimous. And as I was looking back over the records of how people voted to confirm Supreme Court justices, there are dozens of Supreme Court justices that were confirmed by a voice vote. The Senate did not even take down names of who was voting how. So things have changed in a big way. And as we're looking forward now to the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, which we now know are starting September 4th. Every day I get emails in my inbox that say he's so dangerous, he's going to roll back Roe v. Wade, he's going to take away workers' rights and minorities, and they're going to be rolled back for decades. So there's a white-hot spotlight on him, on his record right now. This week, the Judiciary Committee produced 2 big batches of his documents. So as they're pouring through that, we look forward to the September hearings. Now, also in September, the second trial for Paul Manafort, who was President Trump's campaign manager. If you're following his trial right now in Virginia, to remind people, it has nothing to do with Russia. Even though it's the only trial to come from the Mueller investigation, I always like to remind people of the facts, which are, this is about financial crimes that happened long before he was ever associated with the president, briefly as his campaign manager. But of course, that's why it gets all this attention, because of the brief association. Now, if you guys have heard of this Judge T.S. Ellis in the Manafort case, he might be my spirit animal. I don't know. He has been described as an equal opportunity smackdown artist for both sides. He's been hard on the prosecution, he's been hard on the defense, but in this case, the Mueller team has not been real happy with him. This is something he said in the pretrial proceedings before they got started. He said to them, you don't really care about Mr. Manafort. You really care about what information Mr. Manafort can give you to lead you to Mr. Trump and either his eventual prosecution or impeachment. He went on to say, it's unlikely you're going to persuade me the special counsel has unfettered power to do whatever he wants. So, prosecution has had a really rough go with him this time. They were supposed to rest their case yesterday. There's been a delay. They'll do that on Monday, we think, and then it's up to the defense. But it's important to remind people, because there will be, if Manafort is convicted, you know the mainstream media will say, this guy who was the president's campaign manager, this is connected to the Russia investigation. This case did bleed out of that, but it doesn't have to do with that. They'll claim victory, but if he's not convicted, you know the president will do the same thing. He'll say Mueller's team, this is a witch hunt, there was nothing for it. But there's another trial coming, and that's what we have to remember, because in the trial in D.C., this is what Manafort is facing: conspiring to defraud the U.S. government, failure to register as a foreign lobbyist, obstruction of justice, and other charges. Now, this is going to be make or break for the Mueller team, because they're going to be expected at that point to put up or shut up when it comes up to whether they have any connection on Russian collusion and all of these allegations that we've heard for more than a year now. We'll be all watching that with bated breath to see what happens, although this first trial we expect will wrap up well in advance of that. So we don't know where Mueller is in the overall process. We know that this fight continues back and forth, this negotiation, as the two sides are calling it, about whether or not the president should sit down with Robert Mueller or a member of his team, his legal team. Every attorney, including me, that I know, whether they support or don't support the president, says don't do it. They don't think it's a good idea. Our most recent Fox News polling on this, we asked back in June, should he sit down? 60% of those surveyed said that the president should sit down with Mueller. Now, something else interesting in our polling, though, the number of people who said they approve or disapprove of this Mueller investigation is now slowly tightening, because between June and July, the number of people who approve of this investigation has dropped by 7 points, and the number of people who disapprove is up by 3 points, and that's in 1 month's time. So we know that there's a lot of fatigue out there. There's even one survey I saw this week that said a third of Democrats say it's time to wrap it up. They're done with it. We'll see. We had thought there'd be a decision about sitting down for this interview by September 1st. These move. So we'll see as they continue the negotiations. And we continue to learn more about many of the key players. I would guess this crowd, you know all of the people who are here and involved in the case, or you would recognize these names. So this week, Thursday night late, before I went live on my show, we got information about new texts The Hill had uncovered from Bruce Orr, the DOJ employee, and Christopher Steele, the guy who is the author of the so-called Dirty Dossier. Now, these are texts days after President Trump's 2016 inauguration. This is what it says, quote, Steele asked Orr in a January 31st exchange if he could continue to help feed information to the FBI. Quote, just want to check you're okay, still in the situ, we think situation, and able to help locally as discussed along with your bureau colleagues. Or text back to him, I'm still here and able to help as discussed. I'll let you know if that changes. Steele then said, if you end up out though, I really need another bureau contact point number who is briefed. We can't allow our guy to be forced to go back home. It would be disastrous. So who's our guy? What is this all about? Well, that was my first question to my big guest on Thursday night, which was House Oversight Chairman Trey Gowdy. And I said to him, I'm assuming these texts are not new to you. He said, no, they're not. I've seen these months ago as part of House Intel. He said, I find them very troubling. And he said to me on Thursday night, if Bruce Orr and Christopher Steele do not agree to come sit down and explain under oath what this was all about and who these people were that they were talking about, we will subpoena them. So that night we got confirmation too that Goodlatte's office, who oversees House Judiciary, and they're doing this investigation jointly with Trey Gowdy's committee, that they were going to issue subpoenas. Well, then I wake up this morning and see that Jim Jordan has tweeted that Bruce Orr will be in front of Congress on August 28th. So pop your popcorn. I think that might be an interesting one, because we know that they're trying to get Nellie Orr, his wife, who worked at Fusion GPS, Christopher Steele, and many other current and former FBI and DOJ officials before the Hill as soon as possible. So as House Republicans keep fighting for answers about what may have sparked the Russia investigation on then candidate Trump and how it was handled by folks within the FBI and DOJ, nothing seems to be resolved. But do Americans, outside of you very informed folks here, do they care about this? Is this part of their daily life? Is it something that lawmakers hear about when they go home and visit their constituents? So remember the Gallup poll I told you about, where people were asked what's the most important issue facing the country? When they were asked about the situation in Russia in July, it got hash marks, meaning it didn't even rise to 1%, along with the economy and immigration and abortion and all these other things. It gets plenty of attention, it gets plenty of headlines, but it doesn't seem to be motivating voters, as we now are just weeks away from the midterm elections. So what about the midterms? All right, in a Reuters Ipsos poll released this week, the Democrats had a 2-point advantage on the generic ballot. That is a lot tighter than I've seen in most polls over the last 3 or 4 months. Even though they're claiming victory in a number of primaries and special races, that doesn't seem to be translating. Republicans had 39% to Democrats 41%. Now we know every House district is so special and different that when you ask people in poll about their specific representative, these numbers change, but for right now, still pretty tight. Republicans, we know, cannot lose more than 22 seats and still retain control. There are an estimated about 70 key seats in play that are considered make or break for both parties. Well, the president, in a 2-word tweet this week, maintained this prediction: red wave. That's it, 2 words. He's got a strong track record now for the candidates that he's endorsed in a number of primaries and special elections. You know, we had several of those all across the country Tuesday night. He also had a very brief tweet, which is not usually the case from him, the day after he said 5 for 5. So he's feeling good about his track record. I mentioned that special election in Ohio still won't be certified for a couple of weeks, and there's the nail-biter GOP primary in Kansas, where the contender that the president backed, Secretary of State Chris Kobach, has a really tiny lead. I mean, like last I heard, it was 91 votes out of thousands and thousands of votes. As Secretary of State, too, he would be overseeing any kind of recount, so he's been asked to step aside. That's going to play out over the next few days and a couple of weeks as well. But we're still remaining to see how this plays out in the fall. The president says he wants to be out there 6 to 7 days a week campaigning. He tweeted this week: as long as I campaign and or support Senate and House candidates, and then he put in parentheses, within reason. I'm not sure what that means. I should call him. They will win. I love the people, and they certainly seem to like the job I'm doing. If I find the time in between China, Iran, the economy, and much more, which I must, I will have a giant red wave. There's a lot to unpack there. The first time I read it, I thought, oh, my high school English teacher would pass out trying to diagram that sentence. But he gets his point across. We know what he's talking about. So you know that there are key Democrats also out there. They're really trying to capitalize and leverage this motivation they have. The polls show that Democrats are much more motivated going into the fall election, and turnout in midterm and off-season elections is very big. So among the key Democrats out there, the one getting the most attention is New York's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Just weeks ago, she shocked the political world by taking out the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, longtime Congressman Joe Crowley, in their Democratic primary. Now, DNC Chair Tom Perez has described her as the future of the party. She describes herself as a democratic socialist, advocating for things like free college, guaranteed jobs for all with minimum hourly wage of $15 plus benefits, and Medicare for all, among other things. They all sound good on their surface. We all want people to be taken care of and educated and have health care. But the Manhattan Institute put a price tag on that of $42.5 trillion over the first decade, and the programs would cost $218 trillion over the next 30 years. They sum up the study this way. Federal spending, which typically ranges between 18 and 22% of GDP, would immediately soar past 40% of GDP on its way to nearly 50% within 3 decades. Including state and local government spending would push the total cost of government to 60% of GDP, by that point exceeding the current spending level of every country in Europe. When asked how she would pay for it, Ocasio-Cortez said this, quote, "We only have empty pockets when it comes to the morally right things to do. But when it comes to tax cuts for billionaires and when it comes to unlimited war, we seem to be able to invent that money very easily." She was an economics major and international relations. I will not comment beyond that. The Washington Post has done some fact-checking on other statements of hers this week. She said unemployment's low because everyone has 2 jobs. The Washington Post, not a right-wing nutjob rag of a newspaper, said she may personally know people who have 2 jobs, but the data is pretty clear that this statement is poppycock. Bureau of Labor Statistics data show that the percentage of people working 2 jobs has actually declined since the Great Recession. It's been relatively steady at around 5% since 2010. That hardly adds up to, quote, everyone. She also said people work 60, 70, 80 hours a week and can barely feed their families. The Washington Post says the average hours worked per week for private employees has remained steady at just under 35 hours for years. She also claimed that ICE is the only enforcement agency that has a bed quota, that ICE is required to fill 34,000 beds with detainees every single night. The Washington Post says a 2016 appropriations bill required ICE to have 34,000 beds available, not to fill them. That language was eliminated from the 2017 and 2018 appropriations bills. So according to the Washington Post, quote, "It's not even an issue." Nevertheless, as you know, abolishing ICE is also part of the progressive left platform, one that Ocasio-Cortez has taken on the road, joining forces with Senator Bernie Sanders to campaign across the country. Now, their record's been a little less successful than the president so far. 4 of the 6 candidates that they backed in contests on Tuesday lost. So now the Democrat Party stands at a crossroads. They're having to answer a lot of these questions about what they stand for. I don't know if you saw it this week, but former NAACP President Ben Jealous, he's a Democrat. He's running to become governor of Maryland to unseat the incumbent there, Larry Hogan. He was asked by a reporter, quote, "Do you identify with the term socialist?" He replied, and I'm going to edit this, "Are you effing kidding me?" He said the word. I don't say that word. He did later apologize for the salty language, but he's not the only Democrat who now seems pretty irritated about having to answer these questions now about how far left they would go if they're all socialists. The number 3 Democrat in the House, Congressman James Clyburn, told the New York Times this week, being a progressive is an okay thing. Being practical with your progressiveness is another. So they know it's a conversation they now have to have on the campaign trail as well. But let's not forget, Republicans have some of their own inter-family squabbling. We've seen this on efforts to try to repeal Obamacare, to get something done on immigration, the way that they want to fund the federal government, or the wall or not the wall. So if the GOP holds on to the House, though, we know we have 2 of those factions who want to be represented for Speaker. We have Jim Jordan, who I talked about his tweet this morning with the Freedom Caucus, and we have the man viewed as the establishment candidate because he's in leadership now, which is Kevin McCarthy. Members of the Freedom Caucus and other conservatives on the Hill will come to me all the time and say, we're not going to back down from how we're voting because this is what we told people we were going to do and we're not getting it done. So for us, we don't care about the pressure. That's where we are. Now, the establishment privately and sometimes publicly is not happy with their GOP colleagues because they're trying to convince them if they could stick together on key issues that Republicans as a whole would benefit. So there's some family counseling that needs to go on there. They're pointing to tax cuts, the package that passed. And the Heritage Foundation has done an interesting study on this. They crunched the numbers and they found this, quote, every taxpayer, average taxpayer in every state and in every congressional district will see a tax cut in 2018. And this, households will save an average of $1,400. Married couples with 2 children will save $2,917. They've got a very cool graphic if you've been on their website, if you've seen this study. It lights up, it lets you click on different districts and states to see how the tax cuts in the original package would benefit you. And there's not a single district that you can click on that doesn't have some kind of benefit. I pointed this out on my show a couple of weeks ago when the study came out, and I got heat for being partisan, and I thought, I think everybody wants to keep more money of their paychecks. I don't know that, I'm in the news division, I don't have an opinion publicly, we all have opinions, but I don't think saying that people get to keep more of their own money is a bad thing. Am I wrong? Anyway, the conversation is now looking ahead to this second round of tax cuts that Republicans are rallying around and talking about joining forces to get done. The goal is to make the individual tax cuts that are part of this original package permanent. A lot of folks doubt that would get through the Senate and the House. We'll see. The plan would also aim to boost incentives for savings, expanding 529 accounts traditionally used to save for colleges to cover additional things like homeschool expenses and student debt. There's a third prong that's also all about trying to encourage new business investment and make that more reasonable for people. So there's skepticism about which parts of these will get done, but Republicans feel very energized about that moving forward. And they do that against the backdrop of these numbers. These are averages from Real Clear Politics. The president is upside down by his approval-disapproval rating by roughly 9 points, but Congress is upside down by more than 57 percentage points. People are not happy with their inability to get things done. So when the president looks at those numbers, and he's not always a big fan of our polls, he knows that he's definitely got the advantage on Congress when it comes to talking about some of these different issues. Our recent Fox News polling on the issues had good news for the president on a couple of fronts. On the economy, his approval is at a plus 11. On foreign policy, he is at plus 7. So knowing that the president doesn't love all poll numbers, hopefully he thinks that those are positive for him as he looks forward to doing things his own way. And when it comes to foreign policy, how do you guys think he's doing? We talk a lot about the fact that he's taken a very hard line with North Korea. With Iran, clearly there are things there that are not going well, and that's coming to a boiling point. And when you look at the substance of what his administration has done with regard to Russia, and again, another round of sanctions this week with respect to the British, or the spy who was poisoned, or the attempted poisoning of he and his daughter in Great Britain, he does, and his administration has done a number of things, but you know, when he's face-to-face with Vladimir Putin, they're friendlier than a lot of people would like to see. They want to see him be tougher, but it is important to remember the things that have actually substantively happened with this administration with respect to Russia. Okay, so I want to go back to where we started, that terrifying boss that I had in DC screaming at me to get General so-and-so on the phone. I decided to do with him, which I do with most curmudgeons, and there are plenty of them in Washington. I just like to show up with a smile every day. I thought, even though I had little cry breaks in the bathroom down the hall, I wanted to keep a smile on my face. I wanted to tackle everything he gave me with gusto and try to win him over. And I wanted to project to him that I wasn't afraid of him, which clearly I was. But I kept at it all summer as I was just an intern there. And by the last day, I gave him a card, I gave him a hug, which I'm pretty sure is specifically outlawed in the intern manuals now. But he actually kind of laughed and chuckled, and I think that he smiled at me. And it taught me something. I thought, you know, even the person in Washington who seems like the toughest critic, somebody you may not like or have anything in common with, I could see that at heart he was a good person and he had his own way of doing things. And I think if you invest in relationships enough and try to get to know people and meet them where they are, even in Washington, I do think you can find some common ground. And by the way, even without Google, I did get him on the phone with that general. Thank you for having me to share with you guys today. I think I have some questions. I'm happy to take some, if you like. I see some. Or if you just want to yell it out.
I think my voice is loud enough. I want to know why Fox News doesn't talk about the statistics that show what the NFL players and what the Black Lives Matter people supposedly are objecting to, because it's not true, and yet we almost never talk. Statistics are there.
Yeah, you're right. And there's a lot of data out there. There are a lot of studies out there, raw data that can be crunched and can be used to look at very specific positions. I think all of our shows try to do our best with that. Every show is a little bit different. I'm in the news division. Of course, we have the opinion division with Sean and Laura and Tucker and those guys. And so we tackle these stories. There's so many every day. We can't do everything we'd like to do. But I know that that is a topic that's definitely been on a number of the shows. And when I go back, I'll ask them if we could do some more. How about that? All right. Okay. Can you please comment on the likelihood and ramifications of a split within the Democratic Party, a split where they can't agree on votes? I think you see a lot more of that. Whoever asked? Who asked? Oh, okay. I think you see a lot more of that with Republicans, and it's something that I hear from folks all the time who are very frustrated because they think that the Democrats a lot of times, and when Nancy Pelosi is leading the ship, they get in line and they stick together. You don't see them split on a whole lot of things. Republicans are much more, as I talked about that Freedom Caucus split with the establishment, there are a lot more factions within the Republican Party because they'll tell me, we're voting on principle, we're not going to vote the way that our leaders tell us to, where Democrats are more comfortable with that framework for the way that they end up voting. So I don't know that there are going to be a lot of things they split on. I mean, we do see this split right now on immigration because some of them think on impeachment, because a lot of them see that it's a dangerous thing for them. Because when I talked about those numbers that independents and Republicans said they would absolutely vote against someone who is promising impeachment, I think that's one of those things where Democrats realize their split is not good for them. And also this idea of socialism and how far they're willing to go with that, because that wastes a lot of their time on the campaign trail having to talk about impeachment and socialism when they'd rather be talking about how they want to get rid of this president in ways other than impeachment. Why aren't House reps dumping the speaker? Well, he's dumping himself because he is retiring, whoever asked this. I think you're going to see a very interesting fight. If the Republicans hold on to the House, I think this will be a very interesting fight to see how this plays out. It's interesting to me to watch whenever if you watch on, I love C-SPAN, I'm a weirdo. But if you watch these hearings or you watch when they actually do the House floor vote for Speaker, because you don't have to even be a member of Congress to get a vote for Speaker. So it's interesting to see people go up to the mic and say things like, Colin Powell, or people who've never been in the House, but they could be Speaker if they had enough votes. I think if they keep the House, this is going to be somewhere where we will see a real internal struggle. The current Speaker, Paul Ryan, has given his nod to Kevin McCarthy, who's already in GOP leadership and wants to step into that role. I think Jim Jordan stepping up early on in the process and saying, I have a different group of people to represent and I want my voice to be in the mix too, it'll be really interesting because it's not easy to corral cats, which is what you're doing on Capitol Hill all the time when you're trying to get things done. I think that speaker issue is going to be one that could get very interesting. Anything else? Oh, I see a hand back there. That's interesting because Nancy Pelosi seems very secure. There were attempts to, within the party, there are younger people who say, all of our leadership is in their 70s or 80s now. It's time for a new generation of leaders. So we saw some of them like Tim Ryan stand up and say, I'm putting my name out there, I'm going to run. So many of them are being asked on the campaign trail now too, if you guys win, are you going to vote for Nancy Pelosi? Now, a lot of them are saying no. They don't want to be attached to her. She seems supremely confident, though. When you go to her weekly press conferences or talk to her, she says nobody knows the negotiating tactics on the Hill better than she does. And so I think that rightly or wrongly, she doesn't feel like she's going anywhere. So that'll be another interesting one because there are a number of people, even Democrat Linda Sanchez, I think of, who is younger, who has publicly stood up and said, I think that it's time for change, and I'd put my name out there to be part of leadership as well. So she's going to have a little bit of a ruckus in her caucus, I think. Okay. You guys' penmanship is so much better than mine. Okay. Oh, tell us about your career change from law to media. What inspired you to get into the news? Okay, I'll try to keep that short. My husband's here today. He's heard this story. Do you want to come up and tell the story, love? Please give a round of applause to Shannon Bream, my much better half. I would not be doing this without him. That is 100% true. When I was practicing law, he can tell you that I was miserable. I mean, my dad basically told me, you're going to law school or medical school, so pick one, and I don't want to hear about any boys until you're done with one of them. So I went to law school because I am very interested in politics, and I could see the tie-in, and I felt like a law degree would give me a lot of options. So I did practice for a few years, but I never loved it. It was really like a square peg into a round hole. I mean, it was a great career, great money, great advancement, but my heart wasn't in it. I've always been a news junkie, a current events junkie. I think there's probably a few of those in here. And I really just enjoyed following stories and telling stories, digging up stories. So when I was practicing law in Tampa, Florida, got to know some folks at the local ABC affiliate in Tampa, and I said, could I come visit the station? I went over and I said, could I intern here? And they're like, what? You're a lawyer, this is sort of weird. And they said, no, you can't do it unless you're doing it for college credit. So I started to call around to local schools to see if anybody would let me do it, and they all said, no, you're gonna have to come back, get admitted to the communications program, then in your upper classes we'll let you go do an internship. I was not taking no for an answer. So I just kept calling schools and sending them my transcripts back when faxes were a thing. I feel like you guys will know what faxes are. When I speak to colleges, they're like, faxes? What's that? But I faxed all of my transcripts over to this one, the dean at the University of South Florida Communications School, and I just called him nonstop. I was a little bit stalkerish, but I tell young people, you just have to wear them down. That's half the problem. And that's how you get stories on the Hill, too. You just have to chase people around. So I had a meeting with him, and he said, I'll let you do this. You're going to have to take a news writing class, but I'll sponsor you to do the internship as well. So I would practice law during the day, sneak over, because I wasn't allowed to have a second job. And I would sneak over and intern overnight at the station and go out with reporters and people who would just let me take notes and figure things out and see how they found stories and interviewed people and put things together on camera. And I would try to buy them dinner or do something. And I remember one photographer said to me, I don't want anything from you, just when you have someone come to you that needs help, I want you to take them out and let them shadow you. So I try to do that as much as I can. It's the best advice, just to help other people going forward. So I would turn in my work to the boss there and say, could I get some feedback from you? And he was really good about it. Again, the stalking worked. And I wore him down, and so he would meet with me and give me information. And so finally I went to him at the end of my internship, and I said, I'm quitting my legal career and I'm coming to work here. And he said, no one's offered you a job. Just a technicality, but I decided I was going to go for it anyway with the help of my husband, the support of my husband. So I went to my firm and I went around telling each of the partners that I was leaving, and they were all like, you're crazy, what are you doing? Except for a couple said to me, there was always something else I wanted to do, and I wasn't brave enough to walk away and try, so I'm going to be cheering for you. So I got that first job, and I worked 2 a.m. to 11 a.m. at that station, and I answered the phones, and I made coffee, and I had left my legal career behind with my expense account and my secretary and my office and my paralegal, but I was happier than I'd ever been professionally. I knew I was in the right place. So I kept bugging the bosses, and finally I came in one day and he said, we're gonna let you go out and report. You're gonna still have to do your regular job. They had got me working the teleprompter then, and I was producing some cut-ins. He said, but if there's no other human being and news breaks and we need a body, we will let you go. And I just was on top of the world. I thought that was great. So I did that for a few months, still did my 2 a.m. to 11 a.m., but I'd run out and report if they needed something. Started collecting tape, and my boss, I came in one Friday and he was gone. And his boss was gone, as often happens in the media world. Not a lot of explanation. And everybody in the newsroom was freaking out, saying, this is terrible, whenever a new group takes over, everyone gets fired. And I thought, I'm not getting fired, I'm making no money, and I'm doing 3 jobs, and I love it. So 2 weeks into this, the new boss calls me into his office, and I'm like, he's probably gonna promote me. And when the head of HR is sitting there, you're not getting promoted. I learned that the hard way. And he said to me, you are the worst person I've ever seen on TV. You will never make it in this business, and I hope that you're a better lawyer than you are a reporter, because you need to go back to that immediately. It'll keep you humble. But I've always remembered that this is a job, this is not my life. As much as I love, love, love what I do, it's a very subjective business, and that's a long answer. I'm sorry to whoever answered that question. But you know, I stumbled through after losing that job. It took me months to get another interview. I finally, several months later, ended up in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is a fantastic place to live. I see a what back there. Very nice, I loved it there. And while I was there, I got called to come work at the NBC local station in Channel 4 in Washington. And while I was there, Fox was exploding, and I was trying to get my stuff in the door, and they get hundreds of resumes and tapes and things all the time, and I just couldn't get a meeting, an interview, or anything. My agent kept trying. And at that time, my husband was working at the Washington Speakers Bureau, and Britt Hume was one of the people that they booked sometimes. And he had booked Britt for a speech, really early Monday morning, I think it was. And he said, you gotta come with me. This is your chance to meet somebody from Fox and just go face to face. Well, the night before, I was anchoring the 11 o'clock news, and there had been an NFL game or something on that pushed us. We didn't go on until 12:30, 1 o'clock. I got home and was getting to bed, and we had to be up early for the speech, and I thought, I'm not gonna do it. This is embarrassing, and he doesn't know who I am. And Sheldon, to his credit, said, you are getting up. You're going to the speech, if we're gonna meet Britt Hume. It was a breakfast speech. And I looked in the mirror, and I had a huge zit, and I thought, this is not a good first impression. I don't wanna do this. But I tried to get cute, put my outfit on, and go. And when we got there in the green room, Britt was there because the speakers were running behind, and so he was sort of a captive audience. We talked a little bit, and then Sheldon spoke up for me and said, well, I don't know if you recognize my wife. She's a local reporter and anchor here. And Britt said, well, what do you want to do? And it was this gut check moment where I thought, I just got to put it out there. And I said, I want to come work for you at Fox News. And he's like, yeah, I get that all the time. I was sort of like, okay, that went well. So he said, send me your video or your DVD. I'll look at your work and give you some feedback. Here's the mailing address, send it over, and I'd be happy to take a look. And I was a little bit embarrassed and decided to take a little walk around. I left the green room and left the guys there chatting. So while I'm gone, Sheldon could tell you this story better, but Britt says to him, does she like politics? Would she, does she like to cover politics? And he said, oh yeah. He said, when she was in law school at Florida State, she worked in the Florida House. And he said, she went to law school, did she finish? My husband says, yes, she did, she finished with honors. And Britt says, do you think she'd want to cover the US Supreme Court for Fox News? And he's like, well, I don't want to speak for her, but I think so. So I had left totally embarrassed and sort of dejected, and I came, I was walking around the arena where the speech was, the hotel, and I walked back in, and Britt stands up and says, when can you start? And I look at Sheldon and say, what happened? Well, I was gone for 5 or 10 minutes. So it was several months later. I was still under contract at NBC, and there was a lot of back and forth. There's a lot to that story, but it's been my dream job for 10 years, 11 years, and now I do Fox News at night as well as covering the Supreme Court, and I could not feel more blessed to be where I work and to do what I do. So sorry, that was a long answer. I love this last question. It just says, Trey Gowdy for AG? Question mark. I have talked to Trey quite a bit about what he's going to do next, and there are so many people out there who say this to me all the time who would love to see him in there. He is one of the finest prosecutors, and if you watch him during these congressional hearings, I will be busy all day, but the minute I know Trey is up for questioning, I'm like, pause everything else, because I got to see what he's doing. He is a superior legal mind. He is going into private practice and doing other things, but I think you'll continue to hear from him, but just maybe not as the Attorney General, as far as I know. Anyway, thank you very much.